Good morning. About time to begin our Bible class hour this morning. Got quite a bit of material to get through, so I'd like to we'll go ahead and offer a word of prayer, and we'll jump right into our study this morning. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, so grateful for this day you bless us with, Father, and for this Lord's Day and opportunity we have to assemble together this morning, Father, and pray that as we go into the Bible class hour this morning, we study your word with open minds and open hearts, Father, and be good stewards of your word, and pray you'll bless us as we study your word this morning, Father, and pray you'll bless us as we go into the worship hour very shortly as well, and pray that everything we do during that time will be done in spirit and in truth and pleasing to you, and pray for your forgiveness for any sins that are missed in our life, and pray for your continued blessings upon this congregation, every member here, Father, and the good leadership here, and just pray for your continued blessings upon Valdosta and each and every member here, Father, and again, pray for your blessings upon us as we go into our Bible study this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. So we got last week, just a brief review of last week. We started covering Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16, where Jesus tells his disciples, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." So we talked about how the abomination of desolation mentioned in verse 15 was the sign for action given in verse 16, and how that all the other signs that Jesus had given his disciples were not signs for them to do anything, right? There was no action associated with them. This was the only sign that was given that has an action associated with it. So the sign is the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, and the action is for them in Judea to flee to the mountains. So last week we talked about this. We laid out 3 questions that we needed to answer in order to fully understand this passage. What is the abomination of desolation? We started on that last week. We didn't finish it. We'll finish that this morning. What is the holy place that we'll be standing in? And then why do those in Judea need to flee to the mountains? So if we can understand these questions, and I think we can understand verses 15 and 16 of Matthew 24 more fully. So in studying what is the abomination of desolation, Jesus mentions that it was mentioned by Daniel the prophet. So we know that the key to understanding, that term, that phrase, is going to be in the book of Daniel. So we looked at the book of Daniel. Last week we noted that Daniel uses this term, abomination of desolation, a total of 3 times. Sometimes it's worded a little bit differently, but the root of it and all that is still there. But Daniel uses this term 3 times. We looked at Daniel 11, verse 31 last week. We noted that that abomination of desolation mentioned there was in reference to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was that Greek ruler who came and oppressed Jerusalem and stopped the daily sacrifice. We showed that Daniel chapter 12, verse 11 was actually a reference to the crucifixion of Jesus. And so, by process of elimination, we can know that Daniel 9, verse 27 must be the account that Jesus is mentioning or a reference in Matthew 24. But we'll look through, we'll go through that this morning and show how exactly that fits together. Before we do that, I'll give a brief summary of Daniel chapter 9. So, as we mentioned last week, Daniel has 12 chapters that most scholars agree were not written in the order that we have them in the Bible, 1 through 12. They were written in different, the chapters were written in different order over a period of several years in between, spanning most of Daniel's life, most of his time in Babylon. There's not a whole lot of agreement, not good agreement on what order they do come in, but Rex Turner, I think, lays out a good explanation for his chronology of Daniel, the book of Daniel. So, in his opinion, Daniel chapter 9 was the last book written, the last chapter written by Daniel. So that's how we've sort of progressed through our study. But if this was the last book that Daniel has written, it sort of fits, the chronology he gives. But anyway, a summary of Daniel chapter 9. So Daniel's reading. We don't have time to read the whole chapter this morning, so we'll give just a brief summary. Daniel he's reading the Old Testament scriptures, the scriptures that the Jews have at the time, what we would refer to as Old Testament scriptures. It's specifically the prophecies concerning the Babylonian captivity. So remember, Jeremiah had prophesied that Judah would be taken into Babylonian captivity, that it would last 70 years and they would be taken back. So Daniel is reading the books. He calculates the years based on when they were taken to captivity and how much time is left in the 70 years. And he realizes that the 70 years is almost up, or it's close to being up, but yet he sees no sign of the end of the captivity. So he starts wondering, when is the captivity going to end? So he prays to God for this matter over himself and his people and about the captivity. Well, then Gabriel appears to Daniel and gives him, or Gabriel says he comes to give him skill and understanding, but then he also gives Daniel the vision of the 70 weeks. And it's the vision of the 70 weeks is what's going to be important to our study of the abomination of desolation. And again, for time's sake, we could make a study, probably a Bible class study, just out of Daniel chapter 9. But for the sake of our study in Matthew 24, we'll sort of give a brief explanation, go through the 70 weeks to get to the abomination of desolation. So we'll skip to the end of the chapter. So the summary that I've given basically leads us up to here to verse 24. So the rest of the chapter goes through verse 27. And I'm reading from the American Standard Version this morning just because the ASV is a little bit easier to understand, in my opinion, than the King James. And actually, down in verse 27 where it says wing of abomination, there's actually a mistranslation in the King James Version where it translates wing as overspreading. But based on the Hebrew word there, wing is the better translation. But I think in general the ASV is easier to understand in this context, so we're going to use it. So starting in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, this is Gabriel. He's given this vision to Daniel, and Daniel's recounting this vision that's been given to him. 70 weeks are decreed upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and discern that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the anointed one, the prince, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It shall be built again with street and moat, even in troublesome times. And after the 62 weeks shall the anointed one be cut off, and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and even unto the end shall be war. Desolations are determined. And he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and upon the wing of abominations shall come one that maketh desolate, and even unto the full end, and that determined shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. So there's a tremendous amount of information given here in just these 4 verses. And like I said, we could probably make an entire study just on these 4 verses, but for the sake of our study, we're going to try to do it in 1 week's lesson. So first thing we need to point out is that the week mentioned here in the 70 weeks, in verse 24, 70 weeks are decreed upon thy people. The week is not the same as what we would call a week today, our modern day 7-day week. The Hebrew word for week there means a heptad or a period of sevens. So it could be a period of 7 anything, days, weeks, years. But the period of years fits this context, just if we look at how long, and it'll make more sense sort of as we go through, but I think overall this is not talking about days or weeks or months. This obviously has to be talking about years. And we can see that because it's talking about, as we go through our study, it's talking about from the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto the anointed one, the prince, which we'll show is Christ. So the time between the commandment to build Jerusalem and Christ was obviously years and not days or weeks or months. But every week in the 70 weeks is a period of 7 years. So one week would be a period of 7, if that makes sense. 1 week would be a period of 7. So then 70 weeks will be 490 years. So this is just trying to understand the Greek word used for week there a little bit better. So that's the first thing we need to understand, that every week in the 70 weeks is a period of 7 years. So the total time of the 70 weeks given in Daniel chapter 9 is 490 years. So secondly, why is the reference given as weeks, as these 70 weeks? It seems a little bit, maybe a little bit odd to us, I guess. So why use this somewhat confusing language to us for weeks instead of just listing the number of years? Well, I think the purpose of it is, remember that Daniel was praying to God on behalf of the 70 years that they were in captivity, and that was the whole basis of his prayer. He was reading those scriptures and prayed to God about the captivity. So I think the 70 comes into play because there's some symmetry there, rather some divine symmetry between the 70 weeks and the 70 years. But also the original Hebrew would have been understood better than we understand the word week. So it's a little bit confusing because our modern day word for week means something else. But I think the Hebrew, to those that were reading the original Hebrew, would have understood this means a period of 7. So what does all this mean? I'm going through this kind of quick, but so what does all this mean? Daniel chapter 9. Well, the 70 weeks brings us up to Jesus. So we can know that this is talking about Jesus because in Daniel 9:24, these are the things that Gabriel has told Daniel is going to happen at this time. The finished transgression, make an end of sins, make reconciliation for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy. So who else in history could have fulfilled any one of those things, much less all of those things, other than Jesus? We know that Jesus is the only one that could have fulfilled all those things. He made an end of sins, and He made reconciliation for iniquity. He brought in everlasting righteousness, all through His sacrifice for us, right? The shedding of His blood. He sealed up vision and prophecy because look at all the prophecies of the Old Testament that concern Jesus. He fulfilled all those prophecies. Everything was finished at His death. So He did all these things. We know that this is Jesus that this is referring to. Now, some scholars will try to make the argument this is referring to a man named Onias the third, who was the high priest who was murdered. I just don't see how that fits. I don't see I never see a high priest. When have we seen a high priest in Scripture referenced as saying that he made an end of sins or made reconciliation for iniquity? When we know good and well that the law that they were under could not make an end of sins. That's why we needed Jesus. So there's some scholars that will say that, but I don't think there's any way we could argue this is anybody other than talking about anybody other than Jesus. So then notice in verse 25 that the 70 weeks begins with the going forth of the command to restore and to build Jerusalem. So remember, so Judah was taken into captivity. There was multiple groups of people that were sent back over periods of time to go back to Jerusalem, and one of these was taken as the time to go forth, the commandment from the king to go forth and restore and build Jerusalem. So there's two schools of thought on when this time frame starts. The first is with Nehemiah in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, and the second is with the decree to Ezra in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. These are two schools of thought, two opinions out there that you can read in the literature about when this time frame started. We'll go through both just to give a brief overview of each one of them. Going to Nehemiah chapter 2, I'll jump through a couple of verses here in Nehemiah chapter 2, starting in verse number 1. It came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, when wine was before him, that I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been aforetime sad in his presence. Nehemiah is sad because he's heard the news about Jerusalem still being in desolation. Verse 5, and I said unto the king, if it please the king, and if thy servant have found favor in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. So Nehemiah specifically asked the king, let me go back so I can build the city. And then we see at the end of verse 8, the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. So Nehemiah makes this plea, this request to the king, let me go back and rebuild the city. The king allows him to do that, and we know that that's exactly what Nehemiah did. He goes back and finishes the wall and all that in Jerusalem. So the second school of thought says that the decree goes to Ezra. And I know that's a little bit odd because generally we think of Ezra as being, we don't think of Ezra as going back with the authority to build Jerusalem. Ezra being a scribe, we always think of him as going back to rebuild the law or rebuild the people in Jerusalem. But just presenting the two views here, the second view is that Ezra, the decree was given to Ezra. So going to Ezra chapter 7, verses 6 and 7, this Ezra went up from Babylon, and he was a ready scribe in the law of Moses, which Jehovah, the God of Israel, had given. And the king granted him all his requests according to the hand of Jehovah, his God, upon him. And there went up some of the children of Israel, and of the priests, and the Levites, and the singers, and the porters, and the Nethinim, to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes the king. So then if you go to Ezra 9 and verse 9, it says, for we are bondmen, yet our God hath not forsaken us in our bondage, but hath extended loving kindness unto us in the sight of the kings of Persia, to give us a reviving, to set up the house of our God, and to repair the ruins thereof, and to give us a wall in Judah and in Jerusalem. So the second school of thought would say that this verse, Ezra 9, verse 9, says that Ezra had some authority to rebuild the walls, but it wasn't completed until Nehemiah came 13 years later. For our study, it doesn't really matter which one we're looking at. I personally think that the context of Nehemiah fits the context a little bit better, since Nehemiah was the one that said, let me go back to build the city. But these are the two schools of thought that are out there. For our study, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference for the 70 weeks because we can still end up at the same date. I just wanted to present the two schools out there as far as when did this time frame begin. So Daniel chapter 9 breaks the 70 weeks up into three sections. The first is 7 weeks, and then he says 62 weeks, and he says 1 week. If we go back, let me go back this way, wrong way. So if you notice in verse 25, know therefore and discern that from the going forth the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the anointed one, the prince, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So he gives those two sections there. And then notice in verse 27, and he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. So the three sections here, 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 week. But each section has a specific purpose. The 7 weeks would be 49 years. That's the 49 years that it took to rebuild Jerusalem. If you go back to Daniel 9, it says, verse 25 says, "It shall be built again with street and moat, even in troublous times," which we know was true, that the city was rebuilt in troublous times. The next section, the 62 weeks, would be the 434 years from the rebuilding of Jerusalem unto Christ's anointing. So the anointing there would be the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist, because that's when his earthly ministry was started. So the anointing of Jesus could be taken at that time when he began his earthly ministry. And then the last 1 week would be the 7 years of Christ's earthly ministry, which we talked about a little bit last week, that the first 3.5 years he was present for, that was before his crucifixion. After he was put to death, the apostles continued the ministry to the Jews for another approximate 3.5 years, and then the gospel was taken to the Gentiles. Also, we can note that Jesus was crucified about 3.5 years after his baptism, so that fits the timeline. Verse 26 says that the anointed one shall be cut off, and then verse 27 says, "In the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease." So Christ being crucified roughly 3.5 years after his baptism, fits the timeline of him being cut off, of the anointed one being cut off in the midst of the week. But also, that's why the sacrifice and the oblation ceased. And again, sort of like we talked about last week, that after Jesus' death, we had the perfect sacrifice. So once his blood was shed for us, we have the cleansing power that can fully purge our souls of the sin. So there would be no more need for the blood of bulls and goats that could only clean you partially. So that's why the sacrifice and oblation would cease when the anointed one was cut off. So then the abomination of desolation is mentioned in verse 27, and again, notice that it's worded a little bit differently. So verse 27, Daniel 9:27 says, "He shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week." So this is the firm covenant, is the earthly ministry to the Jews. "And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease." That's because he was put to death. "And upon the wing of abomination shall come one that maketh desolate, and even unto the full end, and that determined shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate." So notice again, the wording of the abomination of desolation is a little bit different. But upon the wing of abomination shall come one that maketh desolate. It's interesting that the word wing here is mentioned on the wing of abominations, because the eagle was a symbol of the Roman Empire. The Roman army carried ensigns consisting of eagles and images of the emperor, to which divine honors were often paid by the army. So the eagle would have been noticeable as a symbol of the Roman army, similar to the eagle is a symbol of the United States of America today. So the Romans also participated in pagan worship, which we talked about last week. The word abomination generally refers to abomination, idolatry, abomination, or some detestable thing like an idol. And Josephus records for us, he says, "But now Pilate, the procurator of Judea, removed the army from Caesarea to Jerusalem to take the winter quarters there in order to abolish the Jewish laws. So he introduced Caesar's effigies, which were upon the ensigns, and brought them into the city, whereas our law forbids us the very making of images. Pilate was the first who brought these images to Jerusalem, but as soon as they knew it," talking about the Jews, "they came in multitudes to Caesarea and interceded with Pilate many days that he would remove the images. And he threatened that their punishment should be no less than immediate death, unless they would leave off disturbing him. But they threw themselves upon the ground, laid their necks bare, and said they would take their deaths very willingly, rather than the wisdom of their laws should be transgressed. Upon which Pilate was deeply affected, and commanded the images to be carried back to Caesarea." So we see the Jews were very upset that the Roman ensigns and idols and things represent the emperor and all this was brought into the city. The Jews were upset about that, and they pleaded with Pilate to remove these things, which, based on their significant pleas, he did. But this shows the abominations of the Roman Empire, the idolatry associated with them. Also, during the destruction of Jerusalem, this is near the end of the destruction of Jerusalem, when the city is basically on fire, it's being burnt, it's on the verge of destruction. Josephus tells us that with the rebels driven out into the city and the sanctuary itself and all its surroundings in flames, the Romans carried their standards into the temple court, and set them up opposite the east gate. There they made sacrifice to the standards, and with huge shouts of acclamation hailed Titus as imperator. So we see the abomination of the Roman Empire as far as the idolatry that is associated with them. So in Daniel chapter 9, when we see the wing of on the wings of abomination shall come one that maketh desolate. The wing, the eagle, fits the representation of the Roman Empire. The abomination fits the representation of the Roman Empire, because we see the abominations that they even brought into the temple court. It's interesting, though, that even Josephus himself attributes the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. He says, in the very same manner, Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government, and that our country should be made desolate by them. All these things did this man leave in writing, as God had showed them to him, insomuch that such as read his prophecies and see how they have been fulfilled would wonder at the honor wherewith God honored Daniel. So Josephus even sees this and points out that Daniel 9 is pointing to the Roman government and the destruction of Jerusalem that we know actually came to pass in AD 70. But all this goes to, we're trying to make the connection between what is the abomination of desolation mentioned in Daniel chapter 9. I think we can see that the idea of the Roman government, the Roman army destroying Jerusalem, fits this perfectly. But even there's even more evidence we could point out. For example, notice in Daniel 9:26, and he says, "And after the 62 weeks shall the anointed one be cut off, and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince that shall come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and even unto the end shall be war. Desolations are determined." So if you notice, people of the prince, what is that referring to? Well, Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history records for us. This is basically just the history of how Vespasian becoming emperor and the things that happened, but this is a good summary. So he says, after Nero had held the government for about 13 years, Galba and Otho reigned about a year and 6 months. Vespasian, who had become illustrious in the campaign against the Jews, was then proclaimed sovereign in Judea, receiving the title of emperor from the armies there. Directing his course, therefore, immediately to Rome, he commits the care of the war against the Jews into the hands of his son Titus. So Nero was the emperor when the Jewish revolt started. Shortly after that, Nero is killed. There's some civil war going on in Rome, and multiple people are emperor over just a period of a year or two. That's where Galba and Otho come in. At this time, Vespasian is the Roman general who is fighting back the Jewish revolt. He's in the field on the campaign against the Jews. Then he is proclaimed emperor by the soldiers there. He's out in the field. They proclaim him emperor. He initially declines, but eventually accepts it, and then he goes back to Rome and becomes emperor. It takes him some time to consolidate all the power and things, but he becomes emperor, goes to Rome as emperor. Well, then at that time he commits the campaign against the Jews to his son Titus. So now Titus, being the son of the emperor, could be said to be a prince. So the idea of the people of the prince fits exactly what happened very well. Also, notice that it says that they shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. We know that to be true. We know that Titus was the one. Titus, under the emperorship of Vespasian, was the one that led the assault on Jerusalem in AD 70 and actually destroyed the city and the sanctuary. They destroyed the temple and the city. So we know that happened. That's a historical fact. Also, it says, notice, the end thereof shall be with a flood, and even unto the end shall be war. Josephus records for us, this is, again, at the close to the very end of the war. Jerusalem is in the midst of being destroyed. Josephus he gives a first-hand account. He was there and recorded all this firsthand. He says most of the victims were ordinary citizens, unarmed and defenseless, slaughtered wherever they were found. Corpses piled up around the altar as blood cascaded down the sanctuary steps, and the bodies of those killed on the upper level slivered to the bottom. As the temple burned, anything found was looted, and anyone caught was killed. The slaughter was massive. No pity shown for age, no regard for rank. Children, old men, laymen, priests were killed indiscriminately, and war extended its grip to encompass people of every class and condition, no matter whether they were begging for mercy or trying to resist. The Temple Hill, one huge mass of fire, seemed to be boiling over from its very roots, but you would also have seen rivers of blood outrunning the flames, and the killed outnumbering the killers. Nowhere could the ground be seen, for the corpses covering it, and the soldiers had to clamber over piles of bodies to pursue those still trying to escape. So Josephus paints a pretty very descriptive, very dire situation for the Jews in Jerusalem. But notice he talks about a river of blood coming, outrunning the flames. So when Daniel said the end shall be with a flood, it doesn't sound like the end was with a flood of water, but it was with a flood of blood, as the Jews were slaughtered in Jerusalem. Also, he mentioned that even to the end shall be war, and Jerusalem was destroyed with war even to the end. That was exactly what happened. We see all these things in Daniel chapter 9. We see how they align with world history, for example. So I don't think there's any denying that we could deny the fact that the abomination of desolation mentioned in Daniel chapter 9 is the same abomination of desolation mentioned by Jesus in Matthew 24, and that both of them are referring to the Roman army destroying Jerusalem in AD 70. So now that we've answered the question, what is the abomination of desolation, we can move on to what is the holy place it will be standing in, and why do those in Judea need to flee to the mountains? So Luke gives a great commentary in his gospel account of the destruction of Jerusalem. So notice this is sort of a parallel account with Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16. Luke says, "But when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that her desolation is at hand. Then let them that are in Judea flee into the mountains. Let them that are in the midst of her depart out, and let not them that are in the country enter therein." So Luke tells us that the holy place is the city of Jerusalem. Notice Matthew had said, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Luke says, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies. So these being, they're talking about the same event. Jerusalem must be the holy place. And that's significant because are we talking about the holy place of the temple, or are we talking about God's holy city? So I think the holy place would be the city of Jerusalem, God's holy city. But I think it's interesting that we see this is, ultimately it's sort of a significant difference between Matthew and Luke's account. Well, Matthew mentions the abomination of desolation, Luke doesn't. He leaves that out. So some people might question that and say, is this a contradiction or something wrong? That how come Luke didn't mention the same thing? But I think it's interesting that Luke did not mention the same thing because I think it shows God's providence and the inspiration of the Scriptures, because Matthew's gospel was addressed mostly to the Jewish people, right? Mostly to the Jews who would have been familiar with Daniel and his prophecies. Luke's gospel was addressed mostly to the Gentiles, people who most likely would not have been familiar with Daniel and the prophecies of the abomination of desolation. Why did the Holy Spirit lead Luke to mention Jerusalem compassed with armies? Because if he had mentioned the abomination of desolation in his gospel, it most likely would not have meant the same thing to the Gentiles as it would have been to the Jews. I think that points to, in my mind, it's another evidence for the inspiration of the Scriptures and God's providence. So sort of summarizing everything we've looked at, the whole idea of Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16 is Jesus giving his disciples the sign to flee. He's given them several signs leading up to verses 15 and 16 that did not signal them to do anything. There were things that would come to pass, but he said, the end is not yet. But when they see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, they were to flee. So if we want to, summarize all that, what is Jesus telling them? Basically, he says, when you see the Roman army standing in the city of Jerusalem, then flee into the mountains. So our third question was, why do those in Judea need to flee to the mountains? Well, because the city is being destroyed, or it's about to be destroyed. That's why he's telling them to flee. Now, the next logical question in my mind is, how are you supposed to flee the city if the city is surrounded by armies? And especially surrounded by the greatest army on the face of the planet at the time, right? It obviously would have been significant for the Roman army to be surrounding Jerusalem. So how in the world are the disciples supposed to flee Jerusalem if the Roman army is surrounding them? So I think it's interesting to think about that thought. We can pause for a second and just think about, right, Jesus has given his disciples a command, right? He's told them these signs are going to come to pass. These things are going to happen. When you see the city surrounded by armies, then you need to flee to the mountains. So if I had been in the first century, would I have been able to wait around patiently for Jerusalem to be surrounded by armies and then be ready to flee? Or would I have been, when I hear these rumors, these wars and rumors of wars and all these things, would I have gotten scared and tried to flee the city at that point in time? I think it's interesting if you think about walking by faith. It take a lot of faith in order to stay in the city until the city is surrounded by the army, and then try to flee. Right? These people, the first century Christians, they followed Jesus' command. We'll see that, and I think that's significant because just as the difference between Matthew's account and Luke's account, I think, shows divine inspiration and God's providence. I think what we're about to show significantly shows God's providence for his people and the fulfillment of biblical scripture, or biblical prophecy. So the people are in Jerusalem, and the city is about to be surrounded by armies, right? Remember a few weeks ago we talked about Cestius Gallus, who was a Roman general, who was he initially responded to the Jewish revolt against Rome. It's been a few weeks ago, but last time we talked about him, he had begun his campaign to take back the cities and the garrisons that the Jews had taken. And the last time we talked about him, he was encamped 3/4 of a mile outside Jerusalem. So we're going to pick up with Cestius' attack on Jerusalem and see what happens, and we can see God's providence and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, in the accounts here. So on the 4th day, the 30th of the month, Hyperboretus, he formed up his army, talking about Cestius, and led it straight into the city. The people were virtual prisoners of the rebels, and the rebels themselves, blanching at the sight of Roman military professionalism, abandoned the suburbs and retreated to the inner city and the temple. Once inside the city, Cestius set fire to the area known as Bethsaida, or the New City, and the so-called Timber Market. Then moved on to the upper city and encamped opposite the palace compound. So if we halt right there, just think about, Josephus says that the people were virtual prisoners of the rebels. The rebels wouldn't let anybody leave. The rebels were basically holding people in. You think about how scared and how frightened would the people be that are trapped in the city of Jerusalem as the Roman military is now moving in to capture the city. Josephus then tells us that if he, talking about Cestius, had chosen at that moment to force his way inside the walls, he would have taken the city then and there, and the war would have been at an end. But his quartermaster, Tyrannus Priscus, and most of the cavalry commanders had been bribed by Florus to dissuade him from the attempt. And that was why the war dragged on as long as it did, with complete and an irretrievable disaster for the Jews as a consequence. Then Josephus goes on, the rebels were now reduced to desperate panic. Again, think about being inside the city at this point in time, desperate panic, Many of them were already slipping out of the city, convinced that its capture was imminent. So, if I was a first century Christian, would I follow the Jews that are slipping out of the city, or would I have faith that what Jesus told me is going to come to pass? Josephus then says, if only Cestius had persisted a little while more in the siege, he could have taken the city in short order. Cestius evidently failed to appreciate either the despair of the besieged rebels or the true mood of the ordinary people. As he suddenly called off his troops, nothing untoward had happened to make him abandon his hopes of success, and his withdrawal from the city defied all rational explanation. After this catastrophic defeat of Cestius, many of the prominent Jews left the city like men swimming away from a sinking ship. So Cestius was, according to Josephus, inches away from taking the city of Jerusalem, unbeknownst to anybody else. Nobody knows why he withdrew. Josephus says it defied all rational explanation. He withdrew from the city. If you read on through Josephus' account, you'll see that the Jewish army chased after him. Left the city, chased after Cestius' army, and Cestius faced almost a slaughter himself in the mountains outside Jerusalem, being chased by the Jewish rebels. And now Josephus tells us that prominent Jews left the city like men swimming away from a sinking ship. So it turns out the city was not destroyed. It was surrounded by armies, but it was not destroyed. So guess what the Christians did at this point in time? We looked at this before, but Eusebius tells us again in ecclesiastical history, the whole body, however, of the church at Jerusalem, having been commanded by a divine revelation given to men of approved piety there before the war, removed from the city and dwelt at a certain town beyond the Jordan called Pella. So what would originally be, in my mind, a horrible time to try to escape the city when it's surrounded by armies, turns out God gave the Christians the perfect way of escape, perfect time to escape the city of Jerusalem. Cestius is about to take the city. He calls off his attack. He's in retreat. The Jewish army chases him out of the city into the mountains. They were gone for days and weeks, chasing him in the mountains. You've got prominent Jews leaving the city. It's a perfect time for the Christians to leave the city as well. And we know that at least secular history tells us that 0 Christians were killed in the destruction of Jerusalem. And the reason 0 Christians were killed in the destruction of Jerusalem is because they fled the city to the city of Pella, just like Jesus told them to, when God provided them this opportunity under the attack of Cestius. And then we'll see later that Cestius does not return to fight the Jews. And instead, Vespasian comes back later to continue the assault on Jerusalem. And his son Titus later takes up the mantle and is actually the one that destroys Jerusalem in 70 A.D. But the reason 0 Christians died in the destruction of Jerusalem is because they escaped the city during this time, and they were dwelling in the city of Pella in AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed. So if I think about myself being, in the first century, would I have had the faith to remember Jesus' words, even in the face of the city being surrounded by armies, would I have had the faith to wait for the time that I didn't know that was coming? But I think it's amazing if you see that. I see this as nothing more than God's providence for His people and fulfillment of biblical prophecy, that God provided the perfect way of escape for His people from the city of Jerusalem. But that gets us through the prophecies in Daniel. Gets us through Matthew 25, verses 15 and 16. Again, you can see how this came to pass. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. And we see that's exactly what happened. So that gets us through Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16. We'll pick up next week in verse 17, continue on through the chapter. So I know there's a lot of information we covered this morning. We could have had a study in and of itself of just Daniel chapter 9, much less the other chapters of Daniel that we looked at last week. But I think it makes a good application to our study, Matthew 24. We understand prophecies of Daniel, really help us understand the prophecy in Matthew 24 even better. So, anybody got any questions or comments before we close this morning? All right, thank y'all.